Welcome to the David Pakman Show. My name is Dan Coe, filling in for David Pakman. Please send some vibes his way with a new baby to his family, and please subscribe to his channel. Please, if you also like what you hear today, subscribe to the People's Cabinet. I'm a former White House official who does analysis of the news as well as interviews with leaders shaping America's future. So I want to start with the Ukraine summit today in Alaska. A lot has been made about this, a lot of questions. I think the main question to ask, though, is that what evidence do we have that Trump knows how to outfox Putin? I would say there's not a lot. There's been a lot of admiration that Trump has thrown Putin's way. He has sided with Putin over U.S. intelligence about election interference. He has sent Putin COVID tests in the middle of COVID when Americans were dying. And more importantly, he seems to have this reverence for powerful dictators that obviously he views Putin in that same breath. There were two questions yesterday in the Oval that were particularly concerning that showed kind of where Trump's mindset. And I just want to read both of them. First, one of the questions, are you prepared to offer Vladimir Putin access to rare earth minerals to incentivize him to win the war? Trump says we're going to see what happens. The second question is, would you support or agree to reducing NATO troops in Europe and countries like Poland in order to get Russia to agree to a peace deal? Trump's response was, that hasn't been put before me. I'll think about that for later. Okay, so first and foremost, as we all know, Putin, unprovoked, invaded Ukraine. So the notion that we are going to try to bribe him and give him rare earth minerals that Putin would want in exchange for not trying to take over a country is puzzling at its face, but shows you Trump's mindset. More importantly, though, NATO is an alliance, and I want to play this clip from Senator Chris Coons, for all of you who may not know the details of NATO, that I think summarizes this most effectively.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which just celebrated 75 years, is the most successful military alliance or treaty organization in history. And its core is Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. And it's only ever been invoked once, and that was when the United States was attacked on 9/11. And NATO troops served and fought alongside American troops in Afghanistan for 20 years and took casualties and sacrificed at about the same level as the United States on a per capita basis. They showed up early, they fought bravely, they stood alongside us. They could easily have thrown up their hands and said, this is not our fight. Mainland US was not invaded, it was a simple terrorist attack, but they didn't. They came when called and helped defend the United States and our interests.
So NATO stood with us after 9/11. And obviously, we are far away from Ukraine and Russia geographically. Poland is not. And NATO is standing with Poland to help make sure and dissuade any movement from Putin into Poland. That is the big concern internationally. The fact that Trump would even imply that he would question that alliance, reduce troops, put potentially Poland more in harm's way, is a warning bell for the world. And once again, is a reminder that this is not a president who honors the treaties that this country agrees upon. That makes us all unsafe. And so what is the ideal outcome of what's going to happen at the summit? For that answer, I brought on John Feiner. John Feiner is the principal deputy national security advisor to President Biden. His job was to oversee the entire national security apparatus for the White House. And he joined us to talk about this summit, best and worst case scenarios, and things we need to keep in mind. So without further ado, John Feiner. John Feiner, former principal deputy national security advisor. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
So there's a lot of talk about this summit, about who's calling the shots and what's going to happen in it. I'm not asking you to go through the entire history of Ukraine in 1 minute, but if you could just give us a quick overview of how we got here.
Yeah. So as I think most people watching and listening know, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, against Ukraine, since 2013, 2014, but really expanded its war in February of 2022. And interestingly, just because there's about to be this presidential summit, President Biden and President Putin met, the only time they met during the Biden administration, in the summer of 2021 to talk primarily about the Russian buildup, military buildup that looked like it was going to be threatening Ukraine. The United States had identified that this was a problem, was going around the world telling countries we need to be ready for this. Many countries were skeptical that it would actually happen because it seemed like such an outrageous thing for Russia to essentially try to swallow all of Ukraine militarily. But a few months later, that's exactly what they tried to do.
So, what do you think is the goal of this? It seems like Putin was somewhat of the instigator of having this meeting. It's obviously happening in Anchorage, but there's some history there with Russia and Alaska in general. What do you think is the goal of this conversation from both sides?
So from the U.S. side, there's two theories, and I have my own sense of which one I think is right, but I'll just lay them out so people understand what could be going on. One is that President Trump, having come into office very angry at Ukraine, believing that Ukraine was actually the country that was preventing peace in this conflict and wanting, I think, understandably and admirably, to try to end the war, believed that the way to do that was put a lot of pressure on Ukraine, get Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire, and then, of course, Russia, Vladimir Putin, who Trump has this affinity for, would make peace and the war would be over. So he did that. He put a ton of pressure on Ukraine, and we saw that when President Zelensky came to the Oval Office and they had that famously awkward encounter where Trump was basically scolding him. But it turned out the Ukrainians then called his bluff. They basically said yes to everything the Trump administration was asking for, yes to a ceasefire, yes to terms that probably they don't actually want. But they did this in
like what in a vacuum? I know it's
like being willing to at least talk about ceding some of their territory to Russia. They hadn't actually agreed to do that, but they agreed to put those issues on the table. And then Russia became the party that said no to the ceasefire. And that sort of scrambled. That was, by the way, what many people who've worked on this issue and followed it would have expected, but it sort of scrambled Trump's thinking. And so a month or two ago, he started to really harden his language, at least, about Vladimir Putin and about Russia. Started to threaten new sanctions against Russia and started to resume what he had stopped for many months, which is arms shipments from the U.S. To Ukraine to help them fight the war. So one theory of this meeting is that Trump is going to go in, take a very hard message to Putin, try to extract some concessions from Russia to try to generate a ceasefire that Ukraine can live with and end the war. But I think the other theory, which is every bit as plausible and in my view probably the more likely theory, is that Trump has wanted for a very long time, since his first term in office and probably since well before that, to have this better, cozier relationship with Russia and with Vladimir Putin, who he clearly admires on a personal level. When they met in the first Trump administration, they had this very friendly conversation in which Trump came out publicly and said, my intelligence community thinks a lot of bad things about Russia, but to be honest, President Putin made a very compelling case. And I kind of give him a lot of credit for that, which really horrified people in the government and in the intelligence community and around the country. So I think there is every bit as likely a chance that he is going to use this meeting to try to put U.S.-Russia relationship on a better path. And one signal of that is who's actually going to this meeting from the U.S. side. It is not a delegation of military people from the State Department, which has been historically very tough on Russia. It is a delegation made up primarily of political and economic advisors to the president, the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary, the kinds of people you would bring if you wanted to talk about deepening economic relations between the United States and Russia. We've had sanctions on Russia going back to 2014 and really intensified after 2022. The president has talked about the possibility of easing those sanctions, not increasing them, if he and Putin can come to some sort of understanding. So I think what a lot of people are worried about actually is that this goes the other direction. They have a very positive meeting. The U.S. agrees to a bunch of things that take some of the pressure off of Russia. And Trump then shifts his focus back to trying to make Ukraine make concessions. That's from the U.S. side.
And what do you think Putin's angle is? And can you also just give a brief overview of the significance of Alaska being the venue for this?
Sure. So Alaska used to be a part of Russia until sort of mid to late 19th century when it became part of the United States, and obviously geographically very proximate to Russia, and no Russian president has ever visited there. This will be the first time a sitting Russian president has visited Alaska. And I think that is something symbolically that President Putin wanted. I'm not one of these people who believes when you meet with adversaries diplomatically, it's necessarily a concession. I think diplomacy should be used to advance American interests, even against people we don't like. That said, President Putin has been quite isolated globally since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And for him to get this big meeting for the first time, face to face with an American president, high profile, also high stakes, is actually itself a pretty big victory for Putin. The fact that this meeting is happening at all. And for him, as long as this doesn't end up in a total meltdown, with Trump kind of walking out and saying a bunch of nasty things and imposing a bunch of new sanctions, which, as I said, a month or two ago, he was threatening, and it looks like the US and Russia are more on the same page, that will be a huge win for Putin. He doesn't need necessarily tangible outcomes to have a win. Just the appearance of two big leaders on the big stage deciding the future of the world, with Ukraine, by the way, excluded, obviously, from this conversation.
And what do you make of some of the comments that President Trump made in the Oval yesterday, both potential openness to minerals or other things that Putin may have asked for in the past, as well as potential reduction of NATO troops?
Yeah, so Russia has a lot of things that it wants from the United States. They have been deeply uncomfortable with NATO's presence increasing, the physical presence, the number of troops along their border. By the way, it's worth reminding people that in the Biden administration, we added 2 new countries to NATO after Russia invaded Ukraine, Finland and Sweden, which historically had been so-called neutral countries in Europe, not on the side of Russia, not on the side of NATO. But after Russia did what it did, they came into the alliance and added hundreds of miles to NATO's border with Russia, which was deeply unsettling for Russia. So yes, I do think President Putin will say to President Trump, look, all of these NATO troops on my border are very uncomfortable for me. They make the Russian people feel insecure, like we are going to be attacked by NATO. And if you want a more peaceful environment, you should pull some of those forces back or reduce their number. He will probably also say, look, all of this pressure that you're putting on Russia, it's hurting my country. It's hurting my people as they go about their daily lives. It's turning them against the United States. And if you want a better relationship, if the United States wants a better relationship with Russia, you should turn down some of that sanctions pressure, stop hurting my people. One other thing, Dan, that's just worth mentioning is that a lot of times when leaders get together, it's a big news event in the moment and then sort of fades in the aftermath. In U.S.-Russia relations, there has often been quite consequential actions that took place either in these meetings or just after them. When President Obama met President Putin in 2015, it was in New York at the UN General Assembly. I was there working for John Kerry. That happened 2 days later. The main topics of that conversation were Ukraine and Syria, which Russia was also helping, the Assad regime, which has since fallen. 2 days after that meeting, Russia, for the first time, sent significant numbers of troops and aircraft into Syria, just after President Putin met with President Obama. As I mentioned, when President Biden met with Putin, several months later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And in the Trump-Putin famous meeting in Helsinki, President Trump seemed to side with Putin and against his intelligence community. So unlike a lot of other diplomatic conversations, which are mostly about the photos and the optics, there often is consequential action that takes place either in these conversations or afterwards.
And how do you feel with Ukraine not being in this meeting? Obviously, there's an incremental step, even if Putin and Trump come to an agreement. How unusual is that? And what is the typical process afterwards?
Yeah, so I think the conversations that the Ukrainians and the Europeans have been having with their American counterparts in the buildup to this meeting have been along the lines of don't agree to something that's bad for Ukraine and expect us to go along with it. Expect yourself to be able to impose that agreement on Ukraine because Europe will stand with Ukraine. And you've seen President Zelensky come out and say, look, we are not about to make a bunch of concessions to Russia just because President Trump is going to meet with President Putin. Do not expect that. And I think the Europeans will back him on this. So whatever President Trump and President Putin agreed to, if they want it to actually be implemented in the world, it will have to be something that is consistent with Ukraine's interests and with how Europe sees the conflict, which sometimes is very different from how President Trump sees the conflict.
And finally, just from an American interest perspective, what is the best case scenario of this summit and what is the worst case?
I mean, honestly, for me, the best case scenario is that not all that much happens because I'm worried very much about the United States making major concessions to Russia, either in the meeting privately or even publicly when they talk to the press afterwards. And that President Trump sends what has been the stronger message he's been using publicly about Russia's responsibility and Russia's essentially guilt in continuing to prosecute this conflict against Ukraine. That's the best possible scenario, even if there are no real outcomes. The worst case scenario is that President Trump is charmed by President Putin, as he has seemed to be in the past, that he comes out of the meeting afterwards and says, we had this big, beautiful, he's got a lot of good adjectives, often fantastic conversation, and that I think we and the Russians are on a much closer path as countries and the two of us as leaders going forward. And that could mean things like reducing NATO presence in Europe and reducing sanctions pressure on Russia. I think those things would be disastrous for the United States, certainly also principally for Europe and for Ukraine, which is clinging to a sort of stalemate in this conflict, but it is fragile and day by day. And the US and Europe are keeping Ukraine in the fight.
John Feiner, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.